Hello there. We're back for episode 1 of Where It All Began for Lebanon PA 250 series. I'm your host, Jonathan Miller. We are here in Old Hanover Presbyterian Churchyard in present-day Grantville, Pennsylvania, where once in colonial America, this would have been the frontier. Why we are here is once outside these walls stood the Old Hanover Presbyterian Church, where quite possibly the earliest Airing of Grievances or Declaration of Independence documents was put together by 9 intrepid men. On June 4th, 1774, finally written was what would be known as the Hanover Resolves. This document would be placed into the hands of destiny and made public for the first time. These 9 men knew full well they were taking on the greatest empire on earth, and that this document would be considered potentially as treason, and what waited for them was a traitor's death. But based on principle and a phenomenal courage, they would put forth this amazing document that, like a small stone being thrown into a still body of water, would ripple out the cry for revolution. The most famous line from these Hanover Resolves was that we will trust our cause to heaven and to our rifles. In essence, saying they would hope for peace. They would call out to their God and their Creator, give us a chance to resolve this in a way that would involve diplomacy instead of war. Because the idea of, and our rifles, was that they were going to be willing to pay the ultimate sacrifice. I have to think of it. Great Britain was the greatest empire on earth. What chance did 13 colonies have? These men had fought through the French and Indian War. 4 of them had served honorably, so they knew the cause and the price of war. They understood if they went to war with Great Britain, they stood nearly no chance. But nonetheless, based once again on principle, and that all men were created equal. All men deserve justice and equality. They were willing to risk it all. These 9 men were from various backgrounds, from soldiers to gentlemen farmers to tradesmen, and varied in ages from 55, 56 down to 21 years of age. These men, many had served in the French and Indian War. Some of them had served directly with George Washington. In the American Revolution, many of them or their sons would serve, and there would be a cost for this freedom. So now we're going to talk about these 5 Hanover Resolves. We're going to read them. We're also going to go down to the Pennsylvania Historic Marker on Route 22 to read that marker as well. And then we'll talk about these 9 men, who they were, how they served, and what they mean to us today. The question is, I think the last that you could say, is what kind of actual influence would they have had on, per se, a little over 2 years later, the Declaration of Independence? Well, the direct influence would have been first, within a month, the Hummelstown and Middletown Resolves, and our very own Lebanon had their own resolves as well. Within a month, you would have Colonel John Rogers and Colonel Timothy Green would have been asked to join the Lancaster County Resolves, which would go into greater detail on the actual abuses of the British Empire and the Crown. To the Declaration of Independence, probably nothing. In actuality, Hanover Resolves are not even the most famous Hanover Resolves in America. Hanover Courthouse, Virginia, is actually far more famous, so if you look it up on the internet, this doesn't really come up. But Hanover Courthouse, Virginia comes up, not only because of the men involved, many of who would become founding fathers, but also the fact that they have an extraordinary painting that was made up for that event. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, was very much a man of the moment. So he understood the extraordinary moment that this was, and he knew it had to be written for that very time. He may have been aware, Benjamin Franklin certainly was aware of these Hanover Resolves with the Pennsylvania Gazette. but the Declaration of Independence was written for that very moment. And Thomas Jefferson understood it probably better than anyone. And that's why it stands as one of the greatest political documents in the history of mankind. Yes, mankind. We're here at the Hanover Church, Pennsylvania Historic Marker here at Grantville, Pennsylvania. Hanover Church, about 2 miles north, is the site of this pioneer Presbyterian church founded in 1736. First pastor was Richard Sankey. In the graveyard are buried many first settlers and veterans of frontier wars and the American Revolution. They were here on Route 22, just east of Grantville, at the Hanover Resolves, Pennsylvania Historic Marker. Hanover Resolves, the earliest resolves for independence in the state, drawn June 4th, 1774 by Colonel Timothy Green and 8 Hanover Township patriots. They committed their cause to heaven and our rifles. Once again, I will reiterate what these men did on that day, June 4th, 1774. They were quite profoundly taking their lives, their land, their families, putting them all at risk, because no one really knew what the reaction was going to be of the British Empire or the Crown. In the past, if you did something like this, that would have been treason and it would have been a traitor's death. Now, what helped this to actually take place where it was possible was the fact that this was on the frontier. Normally, you would talk about these things, politics, in your inns, your taverns, pubs, or in the church, any community meeting places. This wasn't very possible in places like Philadelphia, New York, or Boston, simply because there were a lot of British loyalists. And if any kind of talk like this was done, you would be reported. So if a first of this kind, which is more an airing of grievances than, say, a Declaration of Independence, though there is a bit in there, as you'll hear when we read these, quite frankly, it was very, very risky what they did, and they need to be commended, and they need to be remembered for what they did. So let's read those 5 Hanover Resolves now. First, that the recent action of the Parliament of Great Britain is iniquitous and oppressive. Second, that it is the bounden duty of the people to oppose every measure which tends to deprive them of their just prerogatives. Third, that in a closer union of the colonies lies the safeguard of the liberties of the people. Fourth, that in the event of Great Britain attempting to force unjust laws upon us by the strength of arms, our cause we leave to heaven and our rifles. And fifth, that a committee of 9 be appointed who shall act for us and in our behalf as emergencies may require. These 9 intrepid men were none other than Colonel Timothy Green, Colonel John Rogers, James Caruthers, Josiah Espy, Robert Dixon, Thomas Koppenheffer, William Clark, James Stewart, and Joseph Barnett. The 9 men were as follows. Colonel Timothy Green, who would serve in the French and Indian War, knowing Washington, would then go on to serve in the American Revolution as the head of what would become known as the Hanover Associators. Second in command would be Colonel John Rogers, who also had served in the French and Indian War and would later go on to serve under Washington in the American Revolution. James Caruthers, he had served in the French and Indian War, and later a son would serve in the American Revolution honorably. Josiah Espy was only in his 20s. He would go in to serve in the American Revolution once again with honor. Robert Dixon, who was only in his mid-20s, would die a year later of some disease, and his brother would have his son serve in the American Revolution, and that son would go north with General Benedict Arnold and be killed in Canada. And the brother never would recover from the loss of his son. Thomas Koppenheffer was the youngest of the group at 21, would go on to serve in the American Revolution and rise in rank and serve honorably. William Clark was a veteran of the French and Indian War, but he would have his son serve and his son would actually become the 4th treasurer of the United States of America. James Stewart was another man who served in the Revolution and previously in the French and Indian War, and would have a son that would serve honorably as well in the Revolution. And finally, Joseph Barnett, who actually had one of the forts along the Blue Mountains, whose son would be kidnapped during the French and Indian War, but later returned. His son, John Barnett, who is buried in this cemetery at Old Hanover Presbyterian Church, would serve honorably and rise way up in the ranks of, I believe, a major, and served once again honorably. All these men served with honor, whether in both wars or in one or the other, and their sons would follow in their footsteps. Really an extraordinary group of men, and they would all pay a price for that freedom. But nonetheless, we owe them a great deal for what they've done for us. History is out there, my friends. History. It's his story. It's her story. It's our story. History, it lives on in all of us. We'll see you on the next one.